Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
To my golden child, my mother said, lifting her wine glass with that performative grace she's perfected over the years. Her voice dripping with the kind of affection that was as deliberate as it was excluding. The one who didn't let me down. She let the words hang in the air, just long enough for everyone at the table to feel the sting of what wasn't said. And I sat there frozen in place, with a polite smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, and a pressure building in my chest like an overdue scream. The room filled with relatives, neighbors, and her book club friends, the same people who had watched our family from the outside for decades, always commenting on how lucky Karen was to have such accomplished daughters, erupted into claps and warm murmurs, all directed toward my sister Emily, who sat basking in the glow of it all, chin lifted just slightly, her eyes flicking toward mine like she wanted to make sure I was watching. And oh, I was watching. I'd been watching for over 40 years. I could feel Tom's fingers brush lightly against the inside of my wrist beneath the table, a subtle reminder that he was there, that I wasn't alone, that he knew exactly what this moment meant. My husband didn't come from a family like mine. His people yelled, made up, fought dirty, but never let things rot in silence. They never handed out affection like wartime rations, never carved their kids into good and not good enough. He'd never understand all of it, not really. But he knew enough to recognize that my silence wasn't consent. It was a storm waiting. I stared at the woman across from me, this mother of mine in her carefully chosen mauve dress, her hair freshly styled into the same stiff helmet she'd worn since I was 15. She looked like the queen of her own damn universe. She'd always known how to command a room, charm them, disarm them, then crown her favorite like she was bestowing a royal title. Tonight was no different. Except tonight, I wasn't going to take it sitting down. I took a deep breath, picked up the small ivory envelope from my lap, one she hadn't noticed I'd carried in, tucked under my clutch, and I stood up, slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. Emily narrowed her eyes. My mother looked up with a smile that didn't falter right away. I walked over to her side of the table, the room quieting slightly, not enough to be awkward, but enough that people noticed. I leaned in, handed her the envelope, and said in a calm, steady voice, "You'll want to read that in private." I knew damn well she wouldn't. Karen blinked, her fingers grazing the paper, and then without breaking eye contact, she gave a thin, dismissive laugh, the kind she used when she thought someone was making too much of nothing. "Oh, Heather," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You always were the mysterious one." She tapped the envelope against her fingers, like it was a joke card in a party game, and looked around the room. Should we see what's inside? There it was, the choice. And she made the wrong one. She opened the flap with her pinky extended, sliding out the single-type page that I had rewritten at least 20 times, each sentence sharpened like a blade, not out of cruelty but precision. I wanted her to read it when she was alone, because I knew what it would do. I was offering her an out, a chance to preserve whatever illusion she clung to, a window of dignity before the avalanche. But she chose the stage. As she began to read, I saw the shift happen almost instantly. Her eyebrows twitched, her lips pressed into a thin line. And then she started reading aloud, as if doubling down, her voice faltering only slightly in the beginning. "Dear Mom," she read, and even that made Emily flinch. Karen never liked sentiment unless it was hers to control. "I wanted to thank you, truly, for teaching me what it means to be invisible." The silence that followed was the kind that swells with every word, every line heavier than the last. You probably don't remember, but I do. Every birthday Emily had with balloons and pony rides, while mine came and went with chores and maybe a store-bought cake from the clearance rack. There was an uncomfortable shift at the table. One of the cousins coughed. A fork dropped. Still, she kept going, her pride refusing to let her fold. "You always said I was resilient, like that was a compliment. Like it justified the way you handed out praise and affection, like it was something I had to earn by bleeding for it." I watched the color drain from her face as the room went from amusement to unease. Emily looked like she was trying to smile, but her eyes had gone cold. The last part hit like a hammer. You told everyone Emily was your golden child. You never asked why I stopped coming around, why I stopped trying. Maybe now, surrounded by everyone who's always believed your version of this family, you'll finally understand. I wasn't bitter. I was done pretending. Karen stopped reading. She didn't get to the very end, the part that would have blown everything wide open, but the damage was done. Her hands trembled. Emily stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and I sat back down. Some people stared at me with pity, others with awe, a few with judgment. That was fine. Let them think what they wanted, because the truth was this wasn't even the revenge yet. This was just the match. The fire hadn't started, not yet, but it would, and once it did, no one in that room was going to forget it. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't play like a movie, not really. It comes back in sharp flashes, in colors that are too bright or too dull, in smells that catch you off guard years later, in a grocery store aisle, in sounds that echo in your head long after the world around you has gone quiet. I never sat down and made a list of every moment my mother made me feel like I wasn't enough, but the worst of them live right behind my eyes, waiting. And when I walked away from that table at her birthday dinner, I could feel every single one of them rustling just beneath my skin, demanding to be remembered. We were kids. I must have been 8, maybe 9. It was late summer, the kind where the heat sits on your back like a punishment, and the air smells like cut grass and sweat, and the metallic sting of sunburn. Emily had just turned 12, and for her birthday, my mother had thrown a backyard party so elaborate it could have been a scene from a movie. White tables with matching pink tablecloths, a 3-tiered cake from a bakery downtown, custom invitations with gold lettering, even a clown and a petting zoo truck that parked right in front of our house like we lived in some kind of fairy tale. I remember standing by the sliding glass door, holding a paper plate with one soggy hot dog, and watching my mother fuss over Emily's hair, smoothing down strands with spit on her thumb, and adjusting the bow on her brand new dress. She looked so proud, like she'd raised a princess. And in a way, she had. I don't remember if she even looked at me that day. My own birthday, a month later, was an afterthought. No party, no cake that hadn't been frozen from some clearance stack, no cards taped to the refrigerator. I got a sweater, a brown one. No bow, no note. Just Karen handing it to me with a "this should fit you this year" and a shrug like she was doing me a favor. Emily didn't even say happy birthday. I remember asking if I could have a friend sleep over, just one. My mom said we couldn't afford the noise. These were the little things, the 1,000 paper cuts, but some memories cut deeper. There was a time, years later, when I was maybe 14 and Emily had just started high school. She was stunning already, with her thick blonde hair and that easy confidence she carried like it was baked into her bones. She had this way of making people feel small without ever raising her voice. It was like she could just tilt her head and let you know you weren't worth the space you were standing in. Boys started hanging around our house. One of them, Tyler, had a beat-up red truck and eyes too old for his age. He was always too friendly with me, not in a brotherly way, not in the way he should have been. Once, when I was alone in the kitchen, he brushed his hand against the small of my back and whispered something that made my stomach turn. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I told my mom that night, my voice barely a whisper, trying to explain that I didn't feel safe when he came around. She rolled her eyes. "That's Emily's friend," she said, pouring herself another glass of wine. Like that ended the conversation. "Don't be dramatic. You always take things too seriously." And just like that, it was my fault. I was too sensitive, too jealous, too much. That became the pattern. My emotions were always wrong, too loud, or completely invisible. I learned early that the best way to survive in that house was to shrink myself, to be smaller, quieter, to take up less air. I started keeping things to myself, learning how to tell the truth in pieces, how to protect myself without making noise. I didn't have the words for it then, but I knew in my gut that whatever Emily did, no matter how cruel, careless, or manipulative, it would always be forgiven, justified, or worse, ignored. There was one winter when Dad tried to step in. We were in the living room, fireplace on, the house quiet except for the hum of the television playing one of those low-budget holiday movies my mom loved to mock. Emily had lied, again, this time about sneaking out with a boy she wasn't supposed to see. I had caught her climbing back through the window at 2 a.m, reeking of perfume and someone else's cologne. When I told Mom, she turned on me like I'd broken a sacred rule. Dad, tired and disappointed, said something to the effect of, "Maybe Heather deserves to be heard too." She didn't answer him. She just stood up, walked into the kitchen, and didn't speak to him for 2 days. That was the only time he tried to defend me. After that, he mostly stayed quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like betrayal. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It's just that he loved peace more. So I learned to be invisible, to let Emily shine, to play the part of the quiet daughter who didn't stir the waters. But the thing about swallowing truth for too long is that it doesn't disappear. It just hardens. It grows sharp. And one day you either choke on it or you learn how to cut back. People say childhood shapes you, and they're not wrong, but they forget that childhood doesn't end when you leave home. Sometimes it lives inside you, wrapped around your spine, controlling how you move through the world. And when someone like my mother stands up in front of a room full of people and lifts a glass to toast the one who didn't let me down, it's not just painful. It's a reminder of every time I was let down and expected to pretend it never happened. That night, after the toast, after the envelope, after the cracks began to show, I went home and sat on the edge of my bed with that old sweater in my lap. I'd kept it, not because it was sentimental, but because it reminded me of exactly who she was, and exactly what I had survived. And I realized something simple, something hard-earned. You can forgive people without ever letting them hurt you again. But sometimes, the only way to make them understand what they did is to let everyone else see it too. And I had only just started. There are moments in a person's life that don't just stay in memory. They calcify, turn into part of your bones, altering your shape from the inside out, and no matter how many years pass, or how far you run, or how many therapy sessions you sit through trying to rewrite the narrative, it stays, lodged somewhere behind your ribs like a shard you can't quite reach. For me, that moment began with a phone call on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A phone call that seemed innocent enough, routine even, except that I wasn't the one it was meant for, and by the time I hung up, my life had already begun to change in ways I wouldn't fully understand for decades. I was 12 and Emily had just turned 15, caught up in that whirlwind of adolescence where everything felt like a stage, and every decision seemed like a test of whether she could get away with it. She had just gotten her learner's permit and had been begging to drive every chance she could, even though my parents insisted she wasn't allowed to take the car without one of them present. Rules in our house were like curtains, there for show, to impress the neighbors or give an illusion of order. But behind closed doors, it all came down to who could manipulate better. And Emily had that talent down to an art form. I never stood a chance in comparison. That Thursday, our parents weren't home. Dad was working late, and Mom had gone to one of her ladies' wine and book things, which I later realized was just code for drinking with the women she could tolerate enough to gossip with. Emily had been sulking all evening, annoyed that she couldn't go to some party, until suddenly she was gone. Keys missing from the hook, the family sedan absent from the driveway, and me left behind in the kitchen with a plate of pasta and a feeling I couldn't quite name yet. I didn't panic at first. I had learned by then not to question Emily's absences or challenge her decisions, because nothing good ever came from playing the whistleblower in our house. It wasn't until the phone rang, one of those shrill landline rings that slices through silence like a blade, that the unease solidified into dread. A man's voice, older, formal, but not unkind, asked if this was the residence of Karen and Raymond Rowe, and I said yes. He paused, then explained that there had been a minor car accident. No injuries, thank God. But the car had been driven by a minor, a young girl who said she lived at our address. I remember gripping the receiver so tightly that my fingers ached. He asked if a parent could come down to the station to pick her up. I don't remember the exact drive to the police station, because the next thing I knew, my mother was storming through the front door like a hurricane made of rage and fear and something colder underneath, something calculating. She had called me on her way home, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury, asking what the hell happened, and I had told her exactly what the officer had said. By the time we got to the station, Emily was sitting in a plastic chair with her arms crossed, eyeliner smudged, and that smug, bratty smirk that only she could wear in a police precinct. The conversation that followed was not between a mother and her daughters. It was damage control. Karen pulled Emily aside, whispered in her ear, then turned to me with eyes like sharpened glass. She said, "Heather, sweetheart, you're going to tell them you took the car." At first I thought she was joking. Some kind of twisted attempt at diffusing tension with dark humor, something she sometimes did when things got messy. But the look in her eyes made my stomach drop. It wasn't a joke, she was serious. Emily stood behind her, silent, not looking at me, not even pretending to intervene. I opened my mouth to protest, but Mom cut me off. "You're 12, they're not going to charge you with anything. Emily's already on thin ice with school. You'll be fine." I can't describe the feeling that came next. It wasn't betrayal, not yet. It was confusion mixed with shame, mixed with the dawning realization that my role in the family wasn't daughter or sister, but shield. I was there to absorb the blows, to carry the secrets, to protect the image, and the worst part was, I did it. I walked into that room, sat down in front of that officer, and said I had taken the car, that I didn't know I wasn't supposed to, that it was stupid and I was sorry. They called it a warning, nothing more. But I remember the way the officer looked at me, not with anger, but disappointment, like I was already on a path I couldn't walk back from. When we got home, Mom made spaghetti like nothing had happened, humming to herself while Emily sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. No one thanked me. No one even acknowledged what I'd done. I was grounded for 2 weeks, but it was a fake punishment, symbolic so that if anyone asked, there'd be a story to tell. Emily went to a party 2 nights later. My silence had bought her freedom. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't find out until years later when I requested my own juvenile record to clear something for a job background check, was that the warning wasn't just a note. It was a formal record. Not a conviction, not a charge, but enough of a mark that it flagged in certain databases. My mother had lied. She had told me it would vanish, but it hadn't. And that lie, that moment, it ruined something fundamental in me. Not just trust, not just the belief that I could ever be equal in my family, but something even deeper. The idea that I mattered, that I deserved protection, that my name meant anything more than a placeholder for someone else's mistakes. So when I wrote that letter for her birthday, when I detailed every instance where I had been asked to shrink myself for the sake of her fantasy family, that moment at the police station was the turning point. That was the beginning of the end. That was the lie that taught me who I was in that house. Not a daughter, not even a person, really. Just a story she could rewrite whenever it suited her. But I had learned to write my own now. And this time, everyone was going to hear it. There is something unavoidably grotesque about watching someone try to maintain their carefully manufactured dignity while the scaffolding of their lies begins to collapse in real time, especially when the audience is made up of exactly the kind of people they've spent their entire adult life trying to impress. And for my mother, that audience, those dinner guests sipping wine and nibbling crustless cucumber sandwiches, were not just friends or family, but the mirrors in which she had always admired her own reflection, warped and curated as it may have been. When she held that paper in her trembling hands and read aloud the words I had never dared say before, I could see it in her eyes. Not just the shock of exposure, but the deep, unbearable insult of being made vulnerable without her consent, like she had been caught naked in church. At first there was just the rustle of discomfort. Chairs shifting slightly, someone clearing their throat, a wine glass touching down. just a little too loudly on porcelain, as she read through the first half of my letter with the same brittle tone she used to read credit card bills, detached and disbelieving, as though pretending not to feel the words might somehow strip them of their power. But power doesn't care about your denial, and the more she read, the more it clawed its way through her mask, sentence by sentence, memory by memory, until there was no pretending left. By the time she got to the part where I had written about the lie she made me carry, about the day she let her youngest daughter take the fall so her precious Emily could keep her reputation intact, there was a shift so sharp in the air, it was like a knife had passed through the room. I saw it in the eyes of the guests, especially the older ones. Her sister Margaret, who had always suspected something was off but never said it aloud. Uncle Vince, who had told me once, when I was 17, that I was too quiet for my own good. And now those same people were staring at her like they didn't recognize her, like they were trying to reconcile the version of Karen they thought they knew with the one unspooling before them in cruel typewritten honesty. And then there was Emily, sitting at the opposite end of the table, her perfectly curled hair and diamond necklace looking absurdly out of place in that moment. Her face stuck in a smirk she couldn't quite maintain because no matter how many years had passed, no matter how many times she had come out on top, she had not expected this. Not here, not now. "I asked you to read it in private," I said again, my voice low but clear enough to carry. Not because I wanted to gloat, but because it was true. I had offered her a moment of grace, a choice to absorb the truth with dignity, in the safety of her own walls, but she had chosen spectacle. And now she was choking on the very performance she insisted on giving. She stopped reading halfway through the last paragraph, her hand visibly shaking, the paper crinkled and damp where her fingers clutched it. And for a second, I thought she might actually cry. But instead, she folded the paper with mechanical precision, placed it next to her wine glass, and said, with a tight, forced smile that looked more like a grimace, "Well, I suppose everyone's entitled to their version of the truth." There it was, the denial, the backpedaling, the desperate clinging to the illusion that had served her for decades. It was almost impressive in a way, how fast she tried to regain control, launching into a half-hearted toast about families being complicated, and how Heather's always been the introspective one, as if what I'd written was a quirky poem instead of a confession soaked in decades of grief. But the damage was done, and no amount of forced charm could erase the looks around that table, people whispering, people no longer laughing, people who now looked at me not as the bitter daughter, but as someone who had survived something. And then, the moment none of us expected, Emily stood up, not in protest, not in anger, but in the kind of slow, uncertain movement you make when your legs no longer trust the ground you're standing on. Her face was unreadable at first, blank, almost eerily so, and she stared at me for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if she was about to unleash some rehearsed defense or try to spin the narrative in her favor, as she had done so many times before. But then she said it, softly but loud enough. It was true. The room went completely silent. Even the clink of forks stopped. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get expelled," she continued, her voice flat, almost robotic, like she wasn't quite in her body. "And Mom said Heather could handle it, that she was tough, that it wouldn't stick." It was the kind of confession that doesn't bring relief. Not really, because it's too late, and it doesn't change what happened. And it certainly doesn't make up for the years of silence. But in that moment, hearing her say it out loud felt like a window cracking open in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. My mother's face crumpled then, not in sorrow, but in fury. A fury that had nowhere to go. She stood up too, her napkin dropping to the floor, and for a split second, I saw her mouth open like she was about to say something, some defense, some lie, some twisted justification. But nothing came out, just silence. I didn't wait for her to find the words. I didn't need to. I picked up my purse, looked across the room one last time, at the faces now divided, some looking away, others meeting my eyes with something resembling respect. And I walked out, Tom following close behind, his hand gently on my back like a lighthouse pulling me through fog. What struck me most wasn't the silence or the spectacle, or even the fact that Emily had finally admitted the truth. It was the sudden, undeniable understanding that my mother had lost something that night, something she might never get back. Not her reputation, not even her carefully controlled image, but control. She couldn't rewrite me anymore, couldn't edit me out of the story. And I had never felt so clear in my life, the aftermath of truth, when it is no longer whispered or imagined or dismissed as bitterness, but instead declared out loud in a room full of witnesses, does not unfold like a cathartic cleansing or some triumphant finale where justice is served and the wounded walk away healed. No, it arrives messily, staggered in waves of quiet fallout and cold silences, the kind that fill the corners of rooms and phone calls and stretch across the spaces where relationships used to be. In the days that followed my mother's birthday, I didn't receive any flowers or calls of apology, and there was no dramatic gesture of reconciliation waiting at my doorstep. Instead, there was simply the stillness that comes when people don't know what to say to you anymore, when the version of you they were comfortable with has been replaced by someone they can no longer easily define or dismiss. Some relatives reached out in hushed tones, not to offer support, but to gently suggest that I should have handled it differently, that family matters are better kept behind closed doors, as though my mother's decades of favoritism and emotional neglect were simply a series of private inconveniences and not the root of a wound that had shaped every part of who I had become. Others, the ones who had always sensed something was off but never dared speak it aloud, sent quiet acknowledgments, texts with too many ellipses, short messages like thinking of you or that must have been hard, the kind of timid empathy that does little to repair but at least doesn't deepen the fracture. Emily didn't reach out, not directly. She posted something vague and dramatic on social media, a quote about betrayal in family, clearly aimed at painting herself as the victim of some undeserved crucifixion. And although I felt the familiar burn of old resentment rise up in me when I saw it, it passed quickly, like a storm that no longer scared me because I'd finally realized I was standing outside of its reach. She could perform all she wanted. I wasn't in her audience anymore. Tom, steady as ever, said little but held me often. In the quiet hours when doubt began to whisper its way into the corners of my mind, asking whether I had gone too far, whether there might have been a kinder way to claim the truth without burning the whole structure to the ground. But every time I thought about softening my stance, about reaching back toward the wreckage to offer some kind of olive branch, I remembered the little girl I had once been, the one who stood outside her sister's birthday party, with her hair unbrushed and her heart clenched into a tight, silent knot, wondering what she had done wrong to deserve so little. A few days after the dinner, my phone rang, and I saw a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. My father. It had been months, maybe longer, since we'd last spoken. Our relationship always thin, maintained more out of obligation than connection, but something in me said to answer. His voice, when he spoke, was older than I remembered, lined with something that sounded suspiciously like guilt. I read the letter, he said, not even bothering with a greeting. Your mother showed it to me, eventually. There was a long pause, the kind that usually signals a pivot into either denial or deflection, and I braced myself for the usual lines. The request for peace, the discomfort with confrontation, but what came instead caught me off guard. I should have stopped it. I should have done more. I didn't know how to stand up to her, and that's on me. I said nothing at first, because what do you say to an apology that arrives decades late, after the damage has already been done, and the person you used to be has long since learned how to survive without that protection? I believed her version of you, he continued, voice cracking slightly. I let her tell me who you were, and I didn't question it. I'm sorry for that. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to hear it. There was something in his voice that sounded real, something that didn't beg for absolution, but simply wanted to exist in truth, even if that truth was painful. I thanked him, Not because it erased anything, but because honesty deserves acknowledgement, no matter how late it arrives. We didn't make plans to see each other. There was no sweeping resolution, just a phone call hanging heavy in the air like an old coat finally shrugged off. And then, days later, came the voicemail. It was from my mother, and though I didn't answer when I saw her name, I let it roll to voicemail out of curiosity or morbid instinct. I'm still not sure which. Her voice, when I played it back, was wrecked. She was sobbing, loud, guttural, unrestrained, and the message itself was barely coherent. Her words tumbling out in that breathless, wounded way that people use when they feel cornered, betrayed, stripped of the roles they have spent their entire lives performing. "Why did you hate me so much?" she asked, again and again, as though saying it aloud might summon an answer that made sense to her, as though she truly couldn't comprehend that love and obedience are not the same thing, that being a mother in name alone doesn't earn you the loyalty of the child you ignored, shamed, or sacrificed. I didn't return the call. I didn't send a text. I didn't even respond with a single word, not out of cruelty, but because there are moments when silence is the only appropriate reply, the only language that can express the weight of what's been lost. The truth, the real truth, is that I didn't hate her. Not really. What I hated was the version of myself I had to become to survive her, the version that never asked for too much, never cried in front of her, never let the hurt show. And now that version of me is gone, burned away in the fire she helped spark. And in her place is someone who finally understands that sometimes the only way to be free is to stop explaining yourself to the people who never listened in the first place. In the end, I didn't get closure. I didn't get a family photo with arms around shoulders and smiles forced for the sake of keeping up appearances. I didn't get a mother who learned her lesson or a sister who made peace. But I got something else, something quieter, something better. I got to tell the truth. And sometimes that has to be enough.